Daniel works as a cartoon voice actor. He gets into an argument with his boss about the smoking going on in a kids' show and quits. He goes to his kids' school to pick them up. Chris, Natalie, and Lydia are surprised to see their dad, and he also surprises them with a party for Chris's birthday even though their mom said no due to his grades. Daniel's wife Miranda is an architect, and while in the office she gets a phone call from her neighbor. She tells Miranda that there is a big party going on at her house. When she arrives, she sees animals destroying her garden and a whole bunch of kids partying and messing up the house. Miranda and Daniel make eye contact and she shuts the party down. As they fight, they start complaining about their relationship and she asks for a divorce. Daniel stays with his good friend Frank. Miranda and Daniel go to court and the judge grants custody to Miranda. Daniel begs the judge, but because he is unemployed and has no residence, the judge keeps his ruling. He packs up his things and says goodbye to his children. Daniel meets his court liaison, Mrs. Sellner, and asks what he needs to do to get his children back. To get employment, he takes a job stocking films at a studio. Daniel and his kids have dinner in his new apartment. As he asks how their life is going, the kids tell him to try harder to make up with Miranda. She arrives to pick them up, and after a short conversation, she tells Daniel she is going to post an ad looking for a housekeeper. Miranda gets some inquiries about the ad posting, but all of them are Daniel. He uses his talents as a voice actor to portray different women. Miranda rejects all of his advances, except for one. She likes the way this version sounds and sets up an in-person interview. Daniel accepts and tells her his name is Mrs. Doubtfire. He goes to Frank's place and asks him for a costume so that he can become Mrs. Doubtfire. Frank is a makeover artist, and after some trial and error, they end up with the perfect look of an older housekeeping woman. Mrs. Doubtfire arrives at Miranda's place and meets the children. After excusing the children, Mrs. Doubtfire has their interview. While Miranda reads her resume, Mrs. Doubtfire makes tea, but she almost slips up when Miranda mentions that she knows exactly where everything is. But with some quick thinking, Mrs. Doubtfire says all kitchens are the same and Miranda offers her the job. Mrs. Sellner comes over to check up on him. Daniel is still dressed as Mrs. Doubtfire, so he tells her she is his sister. Mrs. Sellner forces her way into the apartment and Mrs. Doubtfire tells her to wait while Daniel finishes a shower. Daniel quickly changes out of his costume while she waits in the living room writing some notes. He rushes out and greets Mrs. Sellner, but while he cleans up, he rambles on about his English sister and slips up saying she can make great English tea. Mrs. Sellner loves English tea and Daniel has to run back and change back into Mrs. Doubtfire. He is surprised by his neighbors and accidentally drops his mask and it lands in the street. He runs into the kitchen to make the tea. Because he has no mask, he uses the cream from a cake to hide his face. Daniel gets a new face from Frank and begins his new work life as Mrs. Doubtfire. Mrs. Doubtfire tells the kids to do their homework and gets into an argument with Lydia. She makes the kids clean the house instead, and when they have had enough they agree to do their homework gladly. As she prepares dinner, she realizes that she can't cook and has a couple of accidents. She gives up and orders from a fancy restaurant and plates it up nicely right before Miranda comes home. She and the kids are amazed at her skill and Lydia apologizes to Mrs. Doubtfire. Mrs. Doubtfire gets closer with the kids and starts learning how to cook. As she starts to get the hang of house cleaning, she also learns that Miranda is dating Stu. Mrs. Doubtfire arrives at Miranda's place and sees Stu's car. She rips off the logo before entering and is introduced to Stu. Because Stu is from England, he asks where she's from, but she expertly dodges the question and hands him the logo to his car. Miranda asks Mrs. Doubtfire to stay extra tonight so that she can go on a date. She tries to convince Miranda out of going but fails to do so. While watching the kids, Mrs. Doubtfire uses the restroom, but Chris walks in and sees everything. Before they call the cops, Mrs. Doubtfire comes clean and tells them everything. He tells them not to mention anything to Miranda or Natalie and keeps a secret between the three of them. Miranda tells Mrs. Doubtfire that Mrs. Sellner came over and mentioned that Daniel had an older lady living with him and Miranda thinks he's moved on from her. As she asks Mrs. Doubtfire for relationship advice, she reveals all the complaints about him. Miranda, Mrs. Doubtfire and the kids head to a pool party hosted by Stu. Because of her costume, she refuses to swim and spends her time at the bar while the family and Stu enjoy the pool. Stu heads to the bar and she hides at the end of the table. She overhears Stu talk bad about Daniel and throws a fruit at his head. Daniel enters a studio at his film stocking job and plays around with the dinosaurs on set. The owner of the studio, Mr. Lundy, observes him and likes Daniel's improv. The current actor for the show is killing the ratings and he wants to have a dinner meeting with Daniel on future projects. Miranda gets ready for a birthday dinner. Stu invited the family and Mrs. Doubtfire, but when she tells her the time and the venue, she panics because it's the same venue and time as Daniel's meeting with the owner of the studio. Upon Natalie's request, she reluctantly agrees. When the family and Mrs. Doubtfire arrive at the restaurant, Mrs. Doubtfire sees Mr. Lundy entering the restaurant at the same time. As the family sits at their table, she gets up to use the restroom and calls Mr. Lundy to get some more time. Mrs. Doubtfire runs into the restroom and changes into Daniel. He hides the costume in a restroom stall and walks to Mr. Lundy's table. When he meets Mr. Lundy, they start by drinking a couple of whiskeys. Right as they're about to discuss business, he looks over at Miranda's table and notices them waiting for her, so he runs to the restroom to change and heads back to their table. After they order, her teeth fall out and she uses it as an excuse and heads back to the restroom to change again. Mr. Lundy sees Daniel wearing lipstick and smells women perfume on him. Daniel avoids suspicion by telling him he was made out with an old girlfriend. Mr. Lundy gets excited and asks if she has a friend. Daniel says he'll go ask and runs off. Mrs. Doubtfire checks herself next to the kitchen and hears the chef working on Stu's food. Knowing that he can't handle spicy foods well, she sneaks into the kitchen to throw some spicy peppers into his dish. She forgets where she was supposed to go, and accidentally sits down at Mr. Lundy's table. Mr. Lundy is shocked because Mrs. Doubtfire speaks in Daniel's voice. Daniel turns it around by saying this will be the host for his new show. Now he is forced to convince Mr. Lundy on why Mrs. Doubtfire would be a good show host. As he discusses with Mr. Lundy, Stu gets his food and chokes on the spice. Miranda yells for help and Mrs. Doubtfire runs over to do the Heimlich. After saving Stu, Mrs. Doubtfire gets up but her mask falls off to reveal Daniel. Everybody stops and stares and Natalie and Miranda are shocked. Miranda is furious and takes everybody out of the restaurant. Miranda takes Daniel to court after the chaotic dinner. Daniel pleads to the judge. He did all that was required, a clean apartment and stable job. But because of his actions as Mrs. Doubtfire, the judge believes that Daniel is too dangerous for his kids to be around and shortens his visitations to one supervised visit a week. Miranda interviews other housekeepers but none are as good as Mrs. Doubtfire. The family reminisce about their times with Mrs. Doubtfire, even Miranda. To their surprise, Mrs. Doubtfire's voice comes out loudly from the television. Mrs. Doubtfire finishes her shoot at the studio. Miranda arrives and waits next to a laughing Mr. Lundy. Mr. Lundy congratulates Daniel and says they're the #1 show right now. She surprises Daniel and congratulates him on the show and says that they watch him every day. Daniel is still hurt and lashes out. Before the fight escalates, Miranda says the kids and herself miss and need Mrs. Doubtfire. At Miranda's place, the doorbell rings and she opens the door to Daniel. Miranda dropped the case and Daniel will always be allowed to see his kids.